The night the Duke of Ashvale walked through the door of the Millhaven Winter Assembly, every head in the room turned toward him. Every head except one. Miriam Hartley stood at the far edge of the candlelit hall, with her hands folded at her waist and her eyes fixed on the frost-rimmed window. And she watched his reflection cross the room the way one watches a storm move across a hillside, at a careful remove, without the luxury of shelter nearby. She had not expected him. No one had. He never attended the Millhaven assemblies. He was a duke. And this was a village hall with wax candles and a quartet that played slightly behind the beat. And the distance between those two facts was not the kind of distance that usually shortened itself. And yet here he was, in a coat that cost more than her remaining income for the year, with his jaw set and his gray eyes moving across the room as though he were taking inventory of something only he could see. What she did not yet know was that he had come specifically and deliberately, and that the last thing he had expected to find there was the reason he had needed to come at all. 14 weeks had passed since Thomas Hartley died of a fever that lasted 6 days and took everything with it when it went. The house in Millhaven, which Miriam had believed was hers by virtue of 11 years of her husband's tenancy, turned out to belong to Thomas's brother Edmund, under an arrangement Thomas had never thought to explain to his wife, and Edmund had never thought to mention until the will was read. The lease reverted. Edmund was very sorry. His solicitor used the word accommodation and charged £10 for the meeting in which it was used. What accommodation meant, in the plain language Edmund chose when his solicitor was not present, was this: Miriam could remain in the house until the end of March, on the condition that she paid down £40 of the £240 Edmund claimed Thomas owed him against the lease, and that she accepted the reduction of her income to £80 per annum from the trust Thomas's father had settled on her when they married. Edmund had said this while standing in her sitting room with his hat in his hand and his eyes moving across the furniture as though pricing it. He had used the word widow 7 times in 12 minutes. He had not used her name once. £80 a year was not nothing. It was a room above a respectable shop in a market town, or plain food, and one serviceable dress every 2 years, or a careful woman's survival in a world that did not particularly want careful women to survive. It was not a house with a garden and a coal fire and a neighbor who brought preserved plums on a Tuesday. It was not the life she had arranged herself inside for the past 7 years. Mrs. Polly Drummond, who lived in the stone cottage across the lane and who had been bringing those preserved plums every Tuesday since the week of Thomas's funeral, had been the one to suggest the Millhaven Assembly. "You cannot stay indoors until spring," Polly had said, setting the jar on the kitchen table with the particular firmness of a woman who has made her decision before arriving. "The mourning period is observed. You have been 10 weeks in black without so much as a church concert. Come on Thursday. It is only dancing and nonsense, and you need not dance." Miriam had agreed because Polly would not be dissuaded, and because she was 24 years old, and the walls of the sitting room had begun to feel like the interior of a box. She had retrimmed the black silk herself, unpicking the old braid and replacing it with a narrower ribbon she'd found in the bottom of Thomas's mother's sewing chest. The gown was correct for half mourning, or nearly correct. Correct enough for a village assembly in a winter that had already buried half its ambitions. She had no jewelry beyond her plain gold wedding ring and a small pearl brooch that had been her mother's, and she wore both because they were hers, and she had nothing else to spend on the appearance of belonging. The Ashvale party arrived late. Lady Dorothea Carew, the Dowager Duchess, came first through the door on the arm of her son's estate manager, followed by Miss Cecily Vane in a gown the color of cream and with diamonds at her throat that caught the candlelight from 20 feet away. Miss Vane was 20 years old and well dowried, and had been in Dorothea's particular company for the better part of 6 weeks, which everyone in the county understood to mean something specific and procedural. Dorothea's eyes moved across the room and found Miriam in the first 3 seconds. "The widow Hartley," Dorothea said, not quietly enough, to the woman beside her. "Still attending. One admires the persistence." The woman beside her made a sound that was not agreement, and was not disagreement, and was perfectly designed to encourage continuation. "Edmund Hartley's sister-in-law," Dorothea added, "the widow with debts." The phrase landed at the precise volume required to be heard by the 3 women nearest the door, and felt by the woman across the room who had very good hearing and a face trained not to show what it absorbed. Miriam absorbed it. She turned back to the frost-filmed window and watched the reflection of the hall with the stillness of a woman who has learned that movement invites remark. She did not see Edmund himself arrive 20 minutes later, slipping through the side door in his green coat, because she was watching a different door. The Duke of Ashvale was 32 years old and had the kind of face that told you nothing about him. It was not unkind, precisely. It was simply uninhabited. The way a very old house looks uninhabited before someone opens the shutters. His jaw was set with the particular discipline of a man who has decided that his face is not available for public use, and his gray eyes moved across rooms rather than settling in them, as though he had already calculated the nearest exit and was keeping it in his peripheral knowledge as a matter of habit. He crossed the floor in 3 strides and stopped 6 feet from where Miriam stood. She had not expected that. No one had expected that. The room adjusted its weight slightly, the way a ship adjusts when the ballast shifts. "Mrs. Hartley," he said. She turned. "Your Grace." "You are standing at the window." "I am." "The assembly is behind you." "I had noticed," she said, and something about the way she said it, level and dry and without the flinching apology the room generally expected from women in retrimmed silk, made him be still for a half-second in a way that was nearly invisible and completely visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Will you walk with me?" It was not precisely a question. It was the kind of sentence that wore the shape of a question the way a command wears a well-tailored coat. She recognized it. And she recognized that refusing it would produce a second kind of public exposure she was not prepared for. And she accepted his offered arm and walked with him along the edge of the hall, because the alternative was standing alone at the window while Dorothea counted her debts aloud. They did not speak much. He asked one question about the condition of the lane from the village to the southern farms after the November frost, and she answered it specifically because she walked that lane twice a week to visit the circulating library in the market square and knew exactly where the ice compacted and where the drainage failed. He listened with the quality of attention she associated with men who had decided to hear what was being said rather than what they expected to hear. It was unusual enough that she noticed it. He left before the second set of dances. He arrived at 11 and was gone by 12:30. His departure, as unremarked as his arrival, had been conspicuous. That was, Polly told her on the walk home, entirely characteristic. He always left first. He had always arrived last. Except tonight. Polly said this as they turned up the lane toward the cottages, her breath clouding in the cold air, her arm linked through Miriam's. "He does not generally attend at all," Polly added. Miriam said nothing. "He spoke to no one else," Polly said, in the tone of a woman who is stating a fact without drawing conclusions and expects her companion to draw them without her assistance. "He asked about the lane," Miriam said. Polly pressed her arm and said no more, but she was smiling in a way that Miriam chose not to examine. Edmund was waiting at Miriam's front step. He had his hat on and his hands behind his back, and the expression of a man who has prepared a speech and intends to deliver it regardless of the hour. He was 43 years old, broad across the chest, with the particular confidence of a man who has spent his adult life watching property transfer toward him through mechanisms he did not have to personally arrange. He believed the law was designed with people like himself in mind. He was not entirely wrong. "I have been patient," he said without greeting. "But the quarter day approaches and the 40 pounds has not arrived, and I am beginning to wonder whether you misunderstood our arrangement." "I did not misunderstand it," Miriam said. She was very tired. The assembly had cost her more than the hours, and Edmund at her step at midnight cost more still. "I have written to you 3 times about the difficulty of the payment schedule. Writing letters does not constitute payment." "No," she said, "it constitutes communication. I had hoped to negotiate the schedule. There is nothing to negotiate." He adjusted his hat. "I will require the 40 pounds by the 15th of February. If it is not received, the debt stands at 240, and I will proceed accordingly." He said the widow with debts as he turned to go. Not loudly, but clearly, and not to her. He said it to the empty lane, or to Polly, who had stopped 20 feet back on the path, or to no one at all. In the tone of a man rehearsing the phrase until it becomes the general understanding rather than his private opinion. The following Thursday, the Ashvale Library received its new shipment of volumes from London, and Miriam went because the circulating library in the Market Square had exhausted everything she had not yet read, and she had applied, with some formality, for permission to use the Ashvale collection on the days it was open to the public. Permission had been granted in writing, in a hand she did not recognize as Julian's. She had not expected it to be. The Ashvale Estate Library occupied 2 rooms in the Old West Wing, with floor-to-ceiling shelves of mahogany and tall windows that let in the pale winter light in long, cold bands across the carpet. There was a reading table at the center, and in the alcove beyond the second arch, a settee where old Mr. Fitch, the Assembly Hall's caretaker, sat twice a week at the insistence of the housekeeper, who believed reading kept his mind from declining. Mr. Fitch was 81 years old and almost entirely deaf, and had been an attendant at the Millhaven Assembly for 40 years before his legs failed him, and was fiercely attached to the illustrated natural histories on the 4th shelf from the left. Miriam noticed him struggling with one of these, the text too small for his eyes and no one nearby to assist, and she sat beside him without particular deliberation and read him 3 pages about the nesting habits of the marsh harrier in a clear, steady voice, pitched not for performance, but for a specific man's specific difficulty, leaning slightly toward his better ear. She did not hear the door at the far end of the room open. She did not hear the single set of footsteps cross to the reading table, or pause there, or remain there for the full duration of the 3rd page. She did not see the gray eyes that had catalogued exits now cataloguing something entirely different, with a quality of attention she would not have attributed to him had she witnessed it. Because the Julian Carew she had met at the assembly had the face of a man who had arranged himself beyond the reach of being moved. He left before she finished the page. She heard the door close as she looked up and found only the long, empty room and Mr. Fitch beaming at the illustration of the harrier's wing. She returned to the assembly 2 weeks later with Polly. Because Edmund had come again to the step, and because the walls of the sitting room had begun to acquire the specific quality of walls that are closing. The dowager was there again. This time she had positioned herself near the refreshment table with Miss Vane at her left hand, and 2 other ladies of the county arranged like a sentence in which Miss Vane was the main clause. Dorothea's fan moved at a measured pace, and her eyes had the quality of a woman who has seen the field, assessed the game, and already knows the outcome. She waited until Miriam was within comfortable hearing distance before she said it this time. "The widow Hartley," she said to Miss Vane, as though offering a lesson. "Edmund Hartley's inconvenient sister-in-law. A woman of debts and reduced circumstances who appears to be making the assembly her monthly project." Miss Vane made no response. Something in her eyes was not what it should have been, for a woman performing confidence. It flickered, very briefly, at the phrase inconvenient, in a way that suggested she had her own understanding of what it meant to be inconvenient in Dorothea Carew's presence. Julian arrived at 20 minutes past 9. He crossed the room in fewer strides than anyone else would have required, and he stopped beside Miriam as though he had known precisely where she would be standing and had navigated directly to that point without consultation. "You came back," he said. "I told you I would," she said. She had not told him anything of the kind, but the sentence came out steady, which was what mattered, because his presence at her side in front of 30 assembled county residents was the kind of fact that required a steady voice. "You did not tell me that," he said. There was something in his voice that was almost not neutral. "I implied it," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the memory of a smile, or the structural possibility of one. She noted it and did not permit herself to note it. He stayed through the first 2 sets and through the supper interval and left at 11:30. Dorothea observed this from the refreshment table with the fan held very still. The following week, Edmund came to the house with the solicitor. The solicitor's name was Mr. Graves, and he had a leather satchel and the expression of a man who genuinely preferred not to be present. He sat at the parlor table and read from a document, while Edmund stood by the window with his arms folded, and what the document said, in the language of the law that made ordinary cruelty sound like administrative procedure, was that the £240 against the lease was due in full by the 1st of March, and that failure to provide that sum would result in eviction from the property and the transfer of its contents to Edmund as partial satisfaction of the debt. Miriam sat at the parlor table and listened. She did not look at Edmund. She looked at the document in Mr. Graves's hands and thought about £80 a year, and the room above the respectable shop in the market town, and whether she could take the writing table with her, because it had been her mother's. Mr. Graves closed the satchel with a particular quietness that meant he was sorry and knew it was insufficient. "I will write to you," she said, when the door had closed behind them. She sat at the writing table for a long time after they left. The coal fire had gone to ash by the time she rose. That same evening, a note arrived from Asheville. It was in Julian's hand this time, and she recognized it as such because she had seen him sign the library permission in passing, and the letters had the spare, clean discipline of a man who had decided that his penmanship would not waste anyone's time. The note was brief. He was hosting a small dinner the following Friday. He would be glad of her attendance. Mrs. Drummond was also invited. He had written her name at the top of the note. Not Mrs. Hartley. Miriam. She read it twice. She set it on the writing table beside the solicitor's document. Then she went to find Polly, because she required someone to confirm that she was reading the 2 documents correctly, that the distance between them was not a thing she had invented in the particular loneliness of an ash-cold room. Polly read them both. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You will need the green wool if the black is too heavy for a dinner." Miriam said, "I have only the black." "Then the black," Polly said, with the firmness of a woman who has decided that the obstacle is logistical and therefore manageable. There were 8 people at the Asheville dinner. Julian sat at the head of the table. Dorothea sat at his left, with Miss Vane beside her in a gown of deep rose that was exactly the gown designed to make every other gown in the room look like an apology. Polly sat across from Miriam, and Edmund Hartley, whom Miriam had not expected to see, sat 3 places to her right in the green coat, and with the expression of a man who had been invited and found the company more varied than anticipated. The meal itself was extraordinary in the way that food becomes extraordinary when you have been eating carefully for 14 weeks. The soup was a consommé so clear it seemed impossible. There were roast partridges and a dressed pike and a cellar's worth of candied fruit arranged on a silver stand that caught the light in small, repeating constellations. Miriam ate with the deliberate moderation of a woman who does not wish to betray how long it has been since she ate this well. Julian spoke to her 3 times during the meal, once about the marsh harrier, which caused her to go very still for a moment, before she understood that he had been in the library. Once about the condition of the southern lane, which had apparently worsened further after the January frost and required new drainage work in the spring. Once, near the end of the meal, about the Assembly's quarterly attendance figures, which he had obtained from Mr. Fitch, with whom he appeared to be on terms of genuine mutual regard. Each time he spoke to her, Dorothea's fan lifted a precise fraction. Edmund watched this. He watched it with the expression of a man who has been playing a particular game and has begun to suspect the rules have been changed without his notification. After the partridge and before the cellar fruit, he reached inside his coat and produced a folded letter. Miriam recognized it before he opened it. It was the solicitor's document, or a copy of it, the letter from Mr. Graves detailing the £240 and the March deadline and the contents of the house as partial satisfaction. Edmund placed it on the table beside his wine-glass with the particular care of a man placing a trump card, and he cleared his throat. "I hope no one will object," he said, into a pause in the general conversation, "if I address a small matter of family business." Julian looked at him. The look was not warm. It was the look of a man who has heard the sentence that is coming and has decided to hear it to its end before responding. "My sister-in-law," Edmund said, "is a woman of considerable charm and no considerable means. I say this not to embarrass her, but because there are people at this table who may not be in full possession of the facts." He unfolded the letter. He read from it. He read the figure £240 in a clear carrying voice. He read the March deadline. He read the phrase partial satisfaction of the debt. The room was very quiet. Miriam sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight, and her face arranged with the particular care of a woman who has learned that the expression of feeling is the one luxury she cannot afford. She looked at the partridge bones on her plate and thought about the writing table and about the room above the respectable shop, and about what Polly had said when she walked Miriam to the door of the Ashvale dinner. "You know what you are." He cannot change that by reading it aloud. She placed her napkin on the table. She rose. She said to the assembled company, in a voice that was entirely even, "I must thank His Grace for a very gracious evening." The dinner was generously given. She looked at Julian once, with the precise quality of a woman who is not asking for anything, because she has decided that asking is the one act that would diminish what she is. "Your Grace," she said. She picked up her gloves. She was going to leave. She had decided on this in the 6 seconds between Edmund unfolding the letter and finishing the first sentence. She had decided it because the alternative was to sit at someone else's table while her debts were read aloud to people she respected. And she would not do that. She would not give Edmund's theater what it required, which was her visible distress. She would leave, and she would go home. And she would write to Edmund's solicitor in the morning, and she would find a way to manage the £240, or she would lose the house. But she would do both things with her dignity intact and her face her own. She pushed her chair in. She took one step toward the door. Julian stood. He did not stand the way men stand when a lady rises. He stood the way a man stands when he has made a decision, and the decision has settled into his body and is no longer available for revision. He was at the far end of the table, and he crossed it in 5 strides, and he stopped beside her, not in front of her, not between her and the door, but beside her, facing the table, facing Edmund and Dorothea and Miss Vane and the assembled company of 8. And he said, without raising his voice or altering the level quality of his gray gaze, "The debt against Mrs. Hartley's lease is mine to settle." The room absorbed this. "It has been mine since Tuesday of this week," he said. "I have purchased the note from Mr. Hartley's solicitor at the stated figure. That is a matter of record." He did not look at Edmund. He looked at the table, at the assembled witnesses, at Polly Drummond, who was watching him with the expression of a woman who has been hoping for exactly this and is now deciding whether to believe it. "Mr. Hartley may address any future correspondence regarding the property to my man of business." Edmund opened his mouth. Julian turned to look at him, turned to look. The look was 3 seconds long and contained no warmth and no hostility, and nothing at all except the quality of a man who has made his calculation and finds the arithmetic very simple. Edmund closed his mouth. "Miss Vane," Julian said, and his voice was quite steady. "I believe you expressed an interest in the library collection before dinner. My housekeeper will show you the catalogue tomorrow, if you wish." Miss Vane understood what she had been given. She understood it as the most gracious displacement she was likely to receive in her 20 years, and she took it with a small nod and something in her face that was not quite relief, but was related to it. Dorothea's fan lay in her lap. Miriam had not moved. She stood beside him with her gloves in her hands and her spine straight, and the pearl brooch catching the light at her collar. And she was looking at the table because she did not yet trust herself to look at him. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she was afraid of what her face would show if she did. She had spent 14 weeks arranging her face, and 14 weeks was a long time, and the arrangement was holding, but only by a very small margin. "Miriam," he said quietly, so that only she heard it, in the particular tone of a man who has had something to say for several weeks and has found the moment impractical until now. She looked at him. His face had changed. Not in the way faces change under public pressure, which is to say it had not done what she expected, which was to reassemble itself behind its discipline. It had done the opposite. The discipline was still present, but it had moved to the perimeter. And what was at the center was something earned, rather than performed. It had cost him to be here. It had cost him to cross the table. Not in the financial sense. Though £240 was not nothing even for a duke, in the sense that he had spent 4 years not crossing rooms toward people, and she was the reason he had remembered how. She thought, with the clear, unhurried certainty of a woman who has learned to trust what her body knows before her mind catches up, that he would tell her this eventually, and she would listen carefully, because she wanted to understand the specific shape of what he had survived. "Sit down," he said, which was the most period-correct declaration of intent she had ever heard, and she sat down, and the dinner resumed. And Edmund folded the letter and replaced it in his coat in the manner of a man who has played his card and found the table already cleared. Later, when the company had moved to the drawing room and the fire was built high against the February cold, Polly stood beside Miriam at the window and said nothing for a long time, which was the particular nothing of a woman who has witnessed something she will be living with for years. Outside, the frost had come back. It was the kind of frost that made the ground ring when you walked on it, each footstep a small bell. The lane to the village was a pale silver line between the dark fields, and at the far end of it, invisible in the dark, was the assembly hall where Miriam had stood at a different window 4 weeks ago and watched a man she had not expected arrive through a door she had not been watching. She had been watching the wrong door. This is the moment in the story when it seems only right to pause, if you have followed Miriam this far, and say, if her particular kind of quiet courage has moved you, leave a word in the comments. She would not have asked you to. That is rather the point. But she would have been glad to know someone was watching. In the weeks that followed, Julian came to the house in the lane 3 times and stayed each time for exactly the length of time that propriety permitted, which was not long enough and entirely appropriate. He brought no flowers, because he was not that kind of man. He brought, on the second visit, a copy of the natural history volume Mr. Fitch favored, because Miriam had mentioned in passing that she had wished to read the 3rd chapter herself, and he had heard the wish in the same way he heard everything, which was entirely and without comment. On the 3rd visit, he asked her a question that was technically several questions but was functionally one, the kind of question that arrives wearing the clothes of practicality and is understood by both parties to be nothing of the kind. He asked it in the parlor with the writing table between them and the coal fire going properly for once, because she had been warned he was coming and had permitted herself that extravagance. She said yes. She said it in the way she said things that mattered to her, which was plainly and without decoration, looking directly at him. He told her about his first wife that same evening. He told her about Eleanor without preamble, the way a man tells a thing when he has decided it will be told, and the only question remaining is how. Eleanor had been 22 years old and confined with their first child in November of 1810, and he had been at the estate in Northumberland, where there was a drainage dispute that could not be settled by anyone but him, or so he had believed, and he had received the letter on the 4th day and ridden through the night and arrived in the early morning to find that Eleanor had been gone for 6 hours and the child with her. He had told no one this. He had told it to the ledgers and to the drainage ditch and to 4 years of estate business that he performed with the discipline of a man who has decided that the ledgers cannot die if he stays close enough to them. The coldness, she understood now, was not the absence of warmth, but its careful containment, the management of a grief that had nowhere to go because he would not permit it to go anywhere that might require him to be present when it arrived. She reached across the writing table and placed her hand over his. He looked at her hand, and then at her face. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "I chose the ditch." "I know," she said. "You were wrong. You know you were wrong. That is not the same as being beyond repair." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the frost held. They were married in the 3rd week of March, at the church in Millhaven, with Mr. Fitch in attendance and Polly Drummond in a new bonnet that she had acquired with the particular determination of a woman who believes that the occasion calls for it. The ceremony was small and private and correct in all the ways that the law and the church required it to be, and Edmund Hartley sent a letter of congratulation that was drafted, Miriam was fairly certain, by his solicitor, who had the better handwriting and the more plausible warmth. Dorothea attended. She sat in the second pew and held her fan and said nothing that could be reported. When the vicar read the names, Miriam saw her press her lips together for a single breath and then release them, and she thought, there it is. The moment a woman discovers that the order she has protected was not as fixed as she believed. There was no cruelty in the thought, and no triumph. Only the clear-eyed understanding that Dorothea had built her confidence on a ground that had not proved solid, and that the ground's instability was not Miriam's doing, and not Miriam's to repair. Miss Cecily Vane was not present. She had returned to her family in Bath the previous week, and 3 months later, Miriam would hear from Polly that she was engaged to a perfectly respectable baronet of her own choosing, which seemed to Miriam to be the best possible resolution for a young woman who had spent 6 weeks being arranged in a hierarchy that was not her natural habitat. Edmund came to the house to collect his remaining correspondence from the parlor on the afternoon before the removal to Ashval. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room and looked at the writing table, which Miriam was directing the footman to wrap in cloth for transport, and he said nothing. His expression had the quality of a man who has run a calculation and found the result disappointing, but not unexpected. He took his correspondence and left. He did not take the lamp he had been eyeing since January. The removal to Ashvale happened on a Thursday, in 3 wagons, with the writing table riding in the second. Polly walked beside the first wagon as far as the lane's end, and then stood with her hands folded and watched them go, because she was not yet ready to live in the county's grandest house, and Miriam was not yet ready to ask her to, and the distance between the stone cottage and the Ashvale gates was not so great that it could not be crossed on a Tuesday with a jar of preserved plums. Ashvale in early spring was a different animal from the cold estate Miriam had attended as a dinner guest in February. The kitchen gardens had begun to show the first green along the south wall, and the chestnut trees along the drive held their new leaves in that tentative way trees have in March, as though they have not yet decided to commit to the season. The library in the west wing received the morning light through its tall windows in long, warm bands that moved across the carpet as the day progressed, and Mr. Fitch came on Thursdays as he had come before. And on the second Thursday, Miriam sat beside him in the alcove and read him the 3rd chapter of the Natural History, the one she had wished to read herself, and he beamed at the illustration of the harrier's wing, as he always had. Julian came to the library door that morning and stood there without coming in, and she looked up and saw him, and did not look away. And he did not look away either, which was still new enough to be noticed. His face was not arranged. It had not been arranged, or not entirely, since the evening in the parlor when she had placed her hand over his and told him that being wrong was not the same as being beyond repair, and the change was the kind of change that goes slowly and then arrives all at once, the way spring arrives. Not all at once, but then suddenly and irrevocably. On the writing table in the study that had been assigned to her as her own room, which was not a thing she had expected and was the most extravagant gift she had received, the solicitor's document lay folded in its original crease. Edmund's letter, the one that had named the £240 and the March deadline and the contents of the house as partial satisfaction. The one Edmund had read aloud at the Ashvale dinner. It had been answered. The debt was settled. The letter was over. She left it there, on the writing table. Not because she needed to see it, but because she had learned that the things you have survived deserve to be kept somewhere you can find them, so that on the days when you cannot remember how much you have survived, you can look at a piece of paper and remember that you sat still while it was read aloud, and then stood up and put on your gloves, and were still entirely yourself. Outside the study window, the assembly hall was a small, pale shape at the end of the valley, barely more than a roof and a chimney from this elevation. The first green was showing in the kitchen garden below. The chestnut trees had committed to the season. She held her mother's pearl brooch for a moment, turning it over in her palm, before she pinned it at her collar and went to find Julian. He was already at the door. If you have stayed with Miriam this far, you already know why that mattered. Leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you. It means more than you might expect.